First off, just wanted to thank the Blockworks team and other sponsors for having us today and for what's been a really excellent conference so far. Really excited to be up here alongside this group of industry legends to talk DeFi 2.0, the next generation of financial primitives. My name's EJ Rogers. I'm co-founder of Fourth Revolution Capital. We're an early stage venture firm investing in teams building the Web3 future across DeFi, GameFi, metaverse infrastructure, DAO tooling. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to panelists, go around the horn and introduce themselves.
Hi, good morning. I'm Alan Chiu, founder and CEO of Boba Network. Boba is an Ethereum layer 2 scaling solution, and we're unique in that we're the only platform that allows smart contracts to call any external API, so it's like connecting your phone to the cloud.
Hey everyone, I'm Carson Cook, founder of two protocols platforms. One is Tokemak, which many of you have probably heard of, launched last summer. It's a decentralized liquidity provider, decentralized market maker, operating under the thesis that as Web3 value flow is replacing Web2 data flow, token exchange is becoming the new information exchange, and therefore liquidity serves the role of bandwidth. Tokemak is really trying to usher in a broadband liquidity bandwidth moment. The second platform is about to launch, and you'll be hearing a lot more about this soon. It's called Membrane. At its core, it is a clearing, netting, and settlement platform that enables bespoke lending and OTC trading at scale. It's going to unlock massive capital efficiency and sits somewhere as sort of a hybrid between DeFi and a centralized exchange.
Hey everyone, I'm Vance Spencer. I'm the founder of Framework Ventures. We're a crypto venture fund operating Web3.
Hi everyone, I'm Ray, one of the co-founders and core contributors at Tracer. And at Tracer, we're building derivatives infrastructure. So not just a single financial primitive, but all the pieces that you need to enable communities, DAOs, and institutions to manage their risk.
Awesome, thanks guys. Really excited to be covering this topic today. I think been a little bit of a rough go for DeFi the last couple weeks, last couple months, but I think we all believe here it's very much not dead. A lot of exciting things coming down the pipe. So to kick things off, I think we can all agree on when we think about DeFi 1.0, what that means, right? Like we think about the blue chips, we think about Uniswap, Compound, Aave, Maker, Synthetics. But when we think about DeFi 2.0, the definition is a little bit more murky, right? Do we think back to DeFi Summer and the food coins? Do we think about Spell and MIM and recursive leverage? Do we think about Tokemak? Where, in you guys' estimation, does the line between where does DeFi 1.0 end, where does DeFi 2.0 begin, and where are we at in that evolution today?
For me, DeFi 1.0 is effectively the verticalized primitives. And so things like spot AMMs, things like borrow lend, things like derivatives, things that are very specific DeFi protocol use cases that are geared towards end users. And I think if you look at that category, you see some of the categories, they have dominant players, Uniswap with 67% of market share, Aave and Compound with a good dominant share of their markets as well. But there's insurance, there's options, there's things that are a little bit more of a horse race that are more open for kind of business in terms of competition. DeFi 2.0 to me is effectively horizontal kind of finance. We talked about vertical finance and all the different verticals. Horizontal to me, and that's kind of what DeFi 2.0 is things like Tokemak, which are a meta liquidity layer that live on top of all the verticals. Things like staking, which cut across DeFi use cases. Things like MEV, which are just living at the bottom of the order book and kind of directing where the flows are. And then things like payment for order flow, which really hasn't shown up in DeFi yet, but it's coming. And so for me, those are the things where it's a little bit more emergent. The vertical plays that we've seen in DeFi, which were, frankly, the first few years, at this point, I think a lot of the winners of those markets have been crowned, and DeFi 2.0 is simply kind of an extension of that trend, but living across the layers, across the DeFi use cases, and Tokemak's a great example of that.
Yeah, and I'll maybe build on that since he made a connection to Tokemak. I'll start by saying what I think DeFi 2.0 was kind of last year, which was sort of when Tokemak came out of the primordial ooze, Olympus, Alchemix. There was definitely a moment in time where it sort of was associated with those, as well as Tracer, actually, at the time. A number of these that sort of came out, and I would say that it was divisive, to say the least. Some loved the term, some hated it, because some thought it meant that we were trying to be disparaging towards DeFi 1.0, which couldn't be further from the truth. I think now the fact that we're still using it this year, I think of DeFi 2.0 very much as being, DeFi N.0. Like this is nothing if not a disruptive industry that's always trying to iterate on itself and find the next thing, Lego things up, rebuild things. And so I think it's all just about what's next, and kind of as Vance was saying, how do you integrate and coordinate the base layers that are being built within DeFi or this DeFi 1.0. And so I very much think of DeFi 2.0 as things that uses the first layer of primitives. And again, you can see you can iterate this thing n times. So I think of DeFi 2.0 as just this process of stacking up further and further. And ultimately, all of this is going to look, I think, more and more like a black box in some sense to outsiders, which isn't by design. It's just the nature of this stuff sinking into a layer of the internet effectively. I think of DeFi as basically a layer of the internet. And within that, you're going to have basically Game of Thrones playing out between tokens, between protocols to find the most efficient financial layer of the internet to do the job and to support the Web3 economy that's coming.
For us, I think the biggest piece in that is the composability piece. We've sort of seen as this DeFi 2.0 movement plays out. I mean, with things like Tokemak and Tracer collaborating, there's a lot more sort of DAO-to-DAO business happening now that all the pieces are truly composable, and basically just relying on what's been built in the past to actually build out these new ecosystems. And yeah, it's super helpful for everyone that's entering the space to have these primitives that they can then build on top of.
Yeah, we think of DeFi 2.0 as not only integrating the various building blocks, foundational building blocks that were built during DeFi 1.0, but also facilitating the movement of liquidity across multiple chains, because one of the transitions between these two eras is really moving from an Ethereum-dominant world to one where we see multiple alt layer ones that have risen up as well. So naturally, the next step is going to be figuring out how do we facilitate a freer flow of liquidity across these different networks, and then beyond that, how do we connect the DeFi world with the TradFi world and think about liquidity flows in that broader context.
Yeah, I want to dive a little deeper into something that Carson and Ray just touched on, which is this notion of the pivot from kind of B2C to B2B or DAO to DAO. I think that is probably one of the common themes across these new primitives that we'll see in this version of DeFi 2.0 to the M.0 point. So how do you guys see that kind of playing out today, and where do you see that going in the future, both kind of the impact to users and to protocols at large?
I'll maybe start on this. So I think there's sort of a definitional question of what DeFi means to different people, and I don't think there's a right answer. In my brain, I think of DeFi very much as this financial layer, and I'll use sort of an analogy here. So if you're currently launching an app on an iPhone, you're an iOS developer, you don't spend all your time thinking about TCP/IP, right? Everything sort of at the bottom layer or like at the network layer is connecting into these things, but that's not where you spend your time thinking. I think very similar thing will happen with DeFi, where ultimately there's going to be all kinds of things that I currently don't define as DeFi. I define them sort of as Web3, but the more consumer-facing applications and user interfaces. And to a consumer, most of them aren't finance or tech nerds like most of us are here. They just care about a great user experience, and if it touches SushiSwap or Uniswap or Aave or Tokemak on the back end or any of these things in tandem, they don't need to care about that, nor should they care about that. And ultimately, even the developers aren't going to care about that. All of these things are going to sink down more to a protocol layer. So for me, I think of DeFi very much as these base layer financial infrastructure things that all these other things can connect into. And then I think you'll have these broader pieces of Web3 that are more consumer-facing, gaming-facing, all these really exciting, broader economies that are coming into this space that ultimately will connect to these things and don't really need to know exactly how they do.
The other thing I'd say is, DeFi 2.0 is also just a developer tool. It allows you, if you want to launch an AMM or you want to launch a derivatives exchange, and you're the 10,000th exchange to have launched, you can be as liquid as Uniswap on day one. And that's just fundamentally a service that a lot of the DeFi 2.0 protocols provide. And so I think to a certain extent, it is a B2B business. It does touch the end users. You do have a relationship with your customers, but B2B is frankly where I think a lot of this goes. It's also just going to be interesting to see when the staking protocols launch and get scale and get live. Those are going to be some of the largest protocols in crypto. If you assume that ETH goes to $1 trillion at some point, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the largest staking network to be only worth $10 or $20 billion. It'll probably be far larger than that. And so, over time, I see the playbook for DeFi 1.0 is kind of the following. You want to acquire consumers, you want to consolidate your lead, and you want to work on value capture and accrual. And I think that is kind of, when I look at Uniswap, that's what they're doing. They're building the wallet. They're, potentially at some point trying to turn on the fee capture. But that's what they're doing. DeFi 2.0, I think, has just a lot more revenue that's endogenous to what they're doing because they're just users of these protocols. And if you think about, the people who are actually winning on all of the AMM trades, it's not really the users of these protocols. Most of the time, it's Jump, Alameda, some of the bigger market makers in the space. And taking dead aim at those types of businesses is the thing that's the most interesting to me about DeFi 2.0, other than just the scale of the endogenous revenue.
Yeah, on that, I think we're going to see a lot more protocols and like Carson touched on, products that spawn on top of DeFi 2.0 that are actually relying on these underlying primitives. We've started to see it. We've started to see protocols that are exclusively building on synthetics or protocols that are exclusively building on other layers. And I think that's going to be probably the next big wave where this tech will be established enough that people can actually build useful user-facing products on top of everything we're all doing here.
Yeah, and I think this question around B2B versus B2C also has to do with your value capture model and go-to-market. Do you want to capture value directly from the end users and own that user experience and be the best in class in that? Or are you going to be focused on creating primitives that will be used by other protocols and focus more in the background, but providing an indispensable piece of the infrastructure?
So when we're thinking about scaling, it's been top of mind for us for years now, right? And we're kind of starting to really see, rollout and adoption of some of the popular and prophesized L2s that will bring scale to Ethereum. How do you guys look at, do we expect that, we're going to end up in this kind of city model that's been the comparison where we have like one L2 is Manhattan, one L2 is Miami. How many do you think are going to become popular? We're going to be in a situation where many dApps are going to end up building their own L2 forks? Do we think that there's going to be kind of an aggregation by sector? What's the latest thinking on how we see that playing out and finally bringing scale that we've been waiting on for all this time?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting analogy, right? Using cities as a mental model. And certainly we're starting to see the emergence of multiple layer 2s or alt layer 1s where each one has its own culture and its own vibe to its community. And when it comes to Boba, for example, what makes us special is we help smart contracts connect to the Web 2 world. They can call any Web 2 API they want. So to use the city analogy, we'll be more like a port city of a large country like Shanghai or LA, where we connect that country to the outside world and enable a lot more trading routes between these countries than if these ports didn't exist. And it will be interesting to see how these cities grow up over time and how each one takes on a unique role in the broader country or even around the world, and how each one finds its own comparative advantage versus other networks.
From our perspective, I do think we'll see a world where protocols have their own L2 or their own chain. And I think with the addition of cross-chain messaging, that means you'll have a central point where your protocol exists, but then you'll have that product actually spread throughout the ecosystem and people from other chains can come and use your chain to interact with your product. I sort of think on top of that as well, we'll see institutions almost becoming their own roll-up or L2 as well. I can see a world where centralized exchanges or exchanges around the world act as a L2. They roll up all their transactions. They settle on your protocol chain, which then settles on something like Ethereum. So I think we're going to get a lot more layers from where we are. And I think cross-chain messaging isn't necessarily solved yet, so it seems promising, but I think there's a lot of things that need to be tested still, and we've seen bridges sort of have a lot of problems as well. So this is a more generalized form, which does, my engineer brain starts to worry, but I do think there will be a world where that is where we end up.
I think one of the core benefits of L2s on Ethereum versus building your own chain is just, to your point, just the security of the bridges. Like, we've had so many close calls bridging stuff that at this point we're just kind of like, we're not going to do that anymore. And I think the dogma used to be, once you hit a certain scale on Ethereum, you'd go and you'd build your own chain. And I think like even people like ApeCoin still believe this, but it just seems like a little bit of a silly exercise where instead of doing that, you could bridge securely to your own L2. You could control your community. You could have the same economics, your own token. And when given the choice, I think the projects are just going to go this route. The one thing I'll say that probably impedes the uptake of L2s is just the speed at which centralized exchanges onboard them. It's taken a year for Binance to onboard Arbitrum. It's taken a long time for them to really even get started on the other L2s. And so there's going to be a world where there's like 1,000 of these different L2s, and they just need to keep up with that.
Yeah, so I think the city analogy is good, and I think my thinking on this has evolved quite a bit in that I can say that my gut right now is there's not going to be one, and there's also not going to be thousands, but I actually think it could be more towards thousands because the same argument was playing out several years back when there was, just as DeFi, it wasn't even called DeFi yet, but as the stuff was taking off and people were still arguing about things like Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, people were literally talking, is there going to be one cryptocurrency or N cryptocurrencies, and is it 10 or is it 10,000? And the right answer is computers don't care. It might be hard for us to wrap our heads around 10,000 token types because we're humans, but just like there's tons of different file types and tons of different ways to store data on computers, computers don't care. They'll take N and it's just as easy, even if it's 100,000 versus 10. So, my thinking is I think I was maybe a little bit narrow in thinking early on this, and I think as long as it's purpose-built and gets the job better, the number N might be quite large, actually.
Yeah, so one of the points Ray just mentioned, thinking about exchanges potentially kind of functioning as their own L2, some sort of roll-up to port back to the main chain. What do you guys see as, in this DeFi 2.0 wave, as the likely newer hooks that are going to bring new users, new use cases into the ecosystem? Maybe start with Vance, because I know you guys see GameFi as one of those hooks that's sort of obfuscating away some of the complexity or putting a more engaging or dynamic skin on some of the DeFi primitives that we're familiar with historically.
Yeah, I mean, the math on gaming is very clear. There's 3 billion people who play games a year. There's 1.5 billion people who have an internet connection who make less than $5 a day. These people are going to be the first natural users of these, play to earn, or play and earn, kind of whatever way you want to call it, games. And so I think that's going to be kind of the most immediate and natural retail funnel. And all of the GameFi investments that we even started, we really kind of started in January of last year. And these things take about 2 years to gestate. It's not just 3 guys in a smart contract and shipping this network. It's a lot more complex than that. And so there's going to be a gestation period, and we're probably 6 to 12 months away from the games launching in kind of their full form. And so I think that'll be one of the most positive catalysts for crypto. And I think DeFi will have to kind of reposition itself so that right now we assume that DeFi is both the use case and the reason why people join. And I think in the future it's going to be the reason why people join is the game, and the use case is basically the financing environment for the open economies that these gaming creates. So that's where we think this is going to come from. So many people have told us that play to earn games aren't going to work, and only the major studios know how to build games that are sufficiently strong to attract a lot of people. I just don't think that's true, and I don't think it's going to be the major studios. It's going to be the indies, and it's going to be the people who are kind of like nights and weekends interested in crypto, building new types of games that we really can't even anticipate.
Yeah, just building on that, it's my personal belief that within 5 to 10 years, gaming is the biggest industry on the planet, probably by a long shot. If you look at what's currently coming at the intersection of gaming, DeFi, NFTs, and AI, there's some incredible and crazy things happening here. And so if you sort of play that forward, I think that one of the big tailwinds, if DeFi can position itself correctly, is to be this financial layer. And sort of, as Vance was saying, it's not going to be people coming because they're hyped up about DeFi. It's going to be coming because there's these crazy experiences. When I say gaming would be the biggest industry on the planet, it's going to look very different than what we define gaming today. It's going to be gaming, entertainment, experiences, gambling. I think everything you can do in the real world, you're going to be able to do, for better or for worse, in a more compelling fashion in the coming interfaces into Web3 or into this gaming universe that is being designed. So I think DeFi will be the ultimate economic engine or financial engine under the hood that's running all this stuff, but consumers aren't going to need to sort of care or want to care exactly how that's carried out. Just like right now, all of you on your phones aren't thinking TCP/IP, you're just surfing the internet.
The other thing I'll say is, people like Tokemak, people like Tribe, kind of the DeFi 2.0 protocols that have a good amount of protocol-controlled value, they're going to be a natural, point of flow into these gaming ecosystems. You'll probably invest in gaming guilds. You'll probably invest in in-game assets. You'll probably provide liquidity for these gaming economies. I really do see the convergence of DeFi 2.0 specifically with games as probably stronger than DeFi 1.0. Because DeFi 1.0, you're always at the risk of being subbed out for someone who's cheaper, who can offer better economics to the game, et cetera, et cetera. DeFi 2.0, you actually have the capital that you can use as effectively a weapon to protect your orientation in the space. And so I think DeFi 2.0 in gaming is another very clear kind of line that I can draw.
I might go back to the infrastructure piece on that too. I think because a lot of these protocols are very generalized, as these new wave games come on, we will actually have all the financial pieces we need. So for example, like one thing we're seeing, players will want to hedge certain risks in games, and they can use primitives that we're building. Players will want liquidity for their in-game assets, for their in-game tokens. They can use Tokemak. Like all these pieces are being built, not necessarily for finance, which I think is the cool thing, but we will see also like more financial players come into the game as the ecosystem just establishes itself even more.
There's almost a natural fit between what we've built in DeFi and a lot of gaming mental models. I've even heard folks say, compare yield farming to playing Farmville with real money. They've already started making these mental connections. And we've also seen players like Robinhood, how they've been able to use gamification to turn something that was previously esoteric, like options trading, into something that is accessible to the mass market. And of course, with Duolingo, how well they're doing, again, using gaming as an interface to something that people used to think was difficult, like learning a new language. So this is definitely the next wave.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, right? Like DeFi, as we've known it to date, wasn't built just for the sake of DeFi, right? Like it was built for the sake of enabling financialization of applications that in Web 2 didn't have direct monetization, and thus we landed in this kind of convoluted ad-based model that's created this system where we have power accruing to the Silicon Valley behemoths, which I think we can all agree is something that we're trying to get away from. So with GameFi kind of being the first proven example of that, what do you guys see as some of the next products or services that will leverage DeFi rails to be able to directly monetize and create Web3 dApps that supersede those that exist in the Web 2 world today, or maybe perhaps even net new products and services that weren't possible in Web 2?
The big one for us is something that most people don't even have access to and don't use, which is risk management. And I guess the funny thing is people don't really even know that they don't have access to it, and they're not aware of how, I guess, sad that actually is. And I think the best use case is the current gas fuel prices that we've seen after this whole war between Russia and Ukraine. If people were actually able to hedge their fuel exposure, they wouldn't be paying these ridiculous prices. They actually would have been able to continue living as they normally would. And yeah, there's a lot of benefit in that, but I think that's a big case where people don't really know that they're missing out. And by enabling that, like actually giving these tools to people that need them across the world, that's going to be super positive.
So I'll give maybe two things. One is I think where all this is going is that you will basically have no friction to transactions in the near future, and that sounds like sort of an abstract statement, but like all of economics or all of business is sort of, and especially in the trading world, but it's much broader than this, is predicated on the fact that you have slippages, you have loss when someone is in the upper hand on a transaction, and if the price is the price is the price, and this is something that Tokemak and a lot of other protocols can help usher this in, where all of a sudden you can get in and out of things with zero friction, zero time delay, zero slippage. That's going to be a massive unlock on the economy in ways that are very hard to describe, and even if we had this whole panel just to cover that topic. Other thing, and this is maybe also seems a little abstract, but I think the applications that are coming are going to be completely insane in a good way, because effectively what DeFi unlocked is the ability to use incentives for whatever outcome you want. And if you think about what's possible with that, everything is possible. So I had this moment in mid-2020 when I was doing a lot of DeFi degenning, if you will, and I was deep on the synthetics protocol, and every week I had to go in and claim my X amount of dollars, which was a very meaningful amount, from synthetics. And it all of a sudden struck me over the head. For me, this was the moment of the singularity. And this might sound silly, but generally humans write code to make computers do their bidding. Everything had inverted, and now the network had incentives, which was making me, the human, come and take an action. And so incentive is effectively code for the human population. Incentives will make people do things. So leave that to your imagination for everything that can be done here. I can tell you every single Silicon Valley or Web 2 model that's being run right now will be put out of business in Web 3 and should be put out of business and replaced by a better model in Web 3.
Now, what we think will be, I think what will be really interesting to see is the convergence of, bringing the Web 2 TradFi world and the Web 3 DeFi world together. And we're already starting to see actually teams building DeFi protocols that are bringing real-world assets and fiat-based cash flows into the DeFi ecosystem. And that's one of the reasons why at Boba we built hybrid compute to facilitate that kind of Web 2, Web 3 interoperability. And what the reason we're excited about this emerging trend in DeFi is because it brings an additional supply of capital to support the yields that are being thrown off by DeFi protocols so that we're not singularly dependent on new token emissions to sustain these yields. And what kind of possibilities might that open up? We could see DeFi protocols that are based on the performance of a particular shopping center, where the yield is tied to the cash flow being thrown off by that shopping center over a certain month or year, or derivatives that are created based on packages of mortgage securities. So I think that's going to be the next frontier. It'll be really interesting to see what that enables and how that changes the DeFi landscape in terms of creating different forms, different yield curves and types of performance and risk-reward profiles.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about this, many L2 future, how do you guys look at building community, maintaining that sense of unity and value accrual in the DeFi 2.0 wave?
I'll maybe start and just say, I don't know that I have the playbook for this, but I think protocols that have done this well have realized that the community is just as important. Like table stakes is a system of smart contracts that are secure, audited, and work and do the function that they want and have an actual business model and generate revenue, right? You have to have that, but that's one of two networks that you have to be very, very cognizant of and optimize. So you have the on-chain network, and by the way, the second one, and we saw some, I think, recently with Stani and where some of the stuff is going. This other one will eventually be on-chain too, but for now, you have to establish the social network. You have to have interest from groups. You have to have people excited. And so it's as someone who admittedly, that's not my expertise, I'm more on the tech side, I acknowledge that is just critical here and will become more and more and more critical as we go more into the consumer-facing, get out from our kind of silo right now that DeFi and all of these experiments, for lack of a better word, that all of us are building, a lot broader than experiments, but at this moment at sort of experimental scale. When this spills over into broad global appeal, we have to make sure that we are thinking on the social side and how to engage communities and get them excited and active.
I think a lot of it also comes down to kind of what is the business model of your L2. And if you look at something like Optimism, how it's constructed is you're auctioning off the role of the sequencer, which has access to all the MEV and all the transaction fees as well of that network. And then the question is kind of what do you do with it? Do you have everyone stake their tokens and give them their pro rata share? Do you put it into public goods funding? Do you invest it extremely aggressively into the DeFi protocols that are on your L2? Do you try to create your own stablecoin? Probably not the last one anymore. And so I think there's only a few really kind of types of business models that you have, and that'll be a large part of dictating what type of community you have and what the general activity revolves around. So it's always from first principles, what are people doing this for? They're economically incentivized, and that's kind of what blockchains are built for. And you have to see that through all the way to just the business model of your L2 if you're going to build a strong community.
Yeah, I think for us, the biggest key piece is that DAOs are actually the enabler of this community. We've seen just really great things come out of DAO to DAO community collaboration, and I think we're going to see that increase as time goes on. The really key missing piece is the tools we actually use. We're all relying on such primitive things like Discord, where people are just sort of bouncing around, getting involved, which is great, but there's no real way to then funnel that into what each team is building. So I think things like what Stani is doing are great for the industry on a whole, because we now have, again, base layer primitives that we can build tooling that is native to the communities we're actually growing. And I think a lot of these DAOs are completely different to real world businesses. They're operating in a completely different way, and that's the power of them. So as we grow the tooling, I think we'll see more collaboration that actually leads to more innovative products, which I'm excited for.
Yeah, and the way we think about our business model is, so I'm a product guy at heart. I think it's important to make sure that the way we monetize is directly aligned with the purposes that our product serves and the interests of the end users. We've already seen the downside of business models where on one hand you try to serve one population, but you monetize from a different population, and how that leads to misalignment of incentives, like a lot of Web 2 entities. So we try to keep things really simple, where we monetize from transactions. So you spend Boba token to call off-chain APIs, you spend Boba token to pay for gas, and the more people use the network, the more revenue we generate. It's kind of simple and back to the basics, but it helps to align incentives between who we serve and how we monetize.
So we've got about 8 minutes left. I have a few bit more thought-provoking questions I'd like to float to you guys, let you opine on them. So thinking back to DeFi Summer 2020, what's one thesis that each of you held then that has either not yet played out or has proven plainly false? And what's one newer thesis that you believe today that you hadn't really considered back then?
I think a newer thesis that I've had is that these institutions are coming in quicker than we think they are, but also that they are going to use Ethereum as a base settlement layer, and that is the world we're going to see. I was quite skeptical early on if we would be able to achieve that, but I think we've seen progress in that area, that these institutions are now willing to collaborate with teams and actually explore using Ethereum for what it's meant to be, this global settlement layer. So I think that's like a positive change in my thesis there.
I think the one that I have is probably, when DeFi Summer hit, it was very clear that options and futures and more complex financial instruments were right on the horizon. And the only blocker was just scaling. I remember DEF CON Osaka, whenever that was, maybe like 3 years ago, the Unipig demo, when it came out, it was like, great, like it's here, like 6 more months, like everyone's gonna be on L2. 3 years later, like we're still making that transition. And I think the complex financial products, they need that type of latency and speed to really operate. And so they've been hamstrung by that. And just to elaborate a little bit more, I thought that we would kind of break down the really speculative side of DeFi's market into kind of like the options and the perp protocols, and maybe they would be about 50-50. Options are super popular in TradFi, and so like I thought that would translate. The thing that's different that I realized today is that perps are really a perfect product. There isn't really anything like that in TradFi, and we invented that from first principles in crypto. And so I'm still very bullish on options, and I think that they're going to come, but I think the size of the perp market is going to be far larger than we anticipate. And we've only started to scratch the surface of really transitioning from these centralized exchanges towards things like DYDX. And people have said that like we haven't really cracked the DeFi derivatives puzzle quite yet. I think that's probably true. But DYDX had more volume than Uniswap for several months during the bull market, and I think that'll come back. And the next time that we run this back with the bull run, I think that the predominant venues of trading and liquidity will be the decentralized derivatives platforms.
I think in 2020, I was thinking of this largely as a retail phenomena, and that was objectively correct at the moment, DeFi, but I have a very different way of thinking about it now with hindsight and with the last couple of years I sort of thought of this as retail because retail was excited about the opportunities and yields here, and to some extent that's correct, but really what's happening is that, and this links back into DeFi 2.0, is the first things that were built needed new things, right? It takes a lot to basically build on-chain, conceptually Wall Street, to make a new Web 3-based economy that's going to be much more massive than the world-based economy we have right now run. And so really what retail was doing was they were actually doing the B2B or P2P protocol-to-protocol game. They were actually filling in for roles that now DeFi 2.0 and beyond are building in. So part of the reason you'd talk to a lot of these self-proclaimed degens in at least the old parlance, right, and they felt so like they looked wiped out, they were exhausted, they were saying they're aging their brains and aging their body very rapidly, was because they were doing, they were retail people, but they were not doing a retail game. They were absorbing the amount that ultimately computer code is supposed to do. So I think what we're going to see And so this is a new thesis that I have that I didn't have then, is that all of this stuff, the things that we've all been doing, many of us in the audience over the last couple of years, will be replaced by these new protocols in DeFi 2.0 and beyond that can do those things and not make us rot our brains trying to remember how all this stuff works and link in and take massive risks on our personal accounts.
I think one of the assumptions from DeFi 1.0 was that I had was seeing the proliferation of all of these protocols, and then later on with the rise of layer ones, was assuming that liquidity fragmentation is a given. That's just the way it is. We don't like it, but tough. But we're starting to see the emergence of different cross-chain messaging protocols and how to make things work in this multi-chain world that actually gives us an inkling of maybe we can solve that problem actually by easing the flow of liquidity across these different cities or nations. And so how might that then further translate to enabling liquidity, more free flow of liquidity between the TradFi world and the DeFi world? And because if we zoom out a little bit, that liquidity fragmentation exists not only within our DeFi ecosystem, this corner of the financial system, right, but also between DeFi and the rest of the world. So could we solve that liquidity fragmentation problem as well, taking some of the mental models of cross-chain messaging into that broader context? So that would be an exciting emerging trend to watch.
Yeah. So to borrow a page from the Peter Thiel playbook here, in the context of DeFi and where we see the industry and sector headed, let's get a bold take from each of you guys. What's one thing you believe is true that few others agree with?
I think the reason why Bitcoin is largely not succeeded as a store of value asset is because it's a structural supply asset. If you think about the miner dynamics, they have electricity costs, they have dollar-denominated costs for other things. They have to sell their Bitcoin, whenever they can. And as the price goes up, it scales linearly with the market cap. And you're dumping more and more Bitcoin the higher the price goes. And the same thing is happening with Ethereum today, where on a daily basis, there's probably 20 million of structural supply that's sold into the market by miners. And if you don't find 20 million of discretionary demand to balance that out, the ETH price goes down. And you're going into a scenario where you're going to have all the structural sellers, all the structural supply wiped out like at one point. And I think that's going to be very powerful in a way that people don't fully realize, where we've spent, at this point, 10 years finding the equilibrium between supply and demand, and that equation is about to shift dramatically. And so, like we've been accused of being ETH maximalists, like we just hold a bunch of ETH. For me, I think that's the most compelling trade in the market, and maybe it's not super contrarian, but I just think if people dug in a little bit deeper, they would realize why it's so powerful.
I may be preaching to the choir here, but I think this would be a very much not known or not believed in thesis to the outside of this room, and that is that the Web3 economy is going to absolutely dwarf our current economy. So, and it's a very simple thought experiment to just see why. So, human-based economics have thus far played out on the surface of the Earth, right? It's a confined space. We now have just unlocked a virtual universe with an infinite expanse or an infinite frontier. We already have built with DeFi and will continue to build the financial infrastructure to enable that. So you do the math on what's coming in terms of value creation and what's going to be out there in a Web3-based economy, and it's going to be absolutely colossal.
Another one that's probably not so radical for everyone here, but I think for the outside world, is that decentralization does truly matter. And for the longest time, I did worry about how we convince the world that that is true. But I think we've had enough examples over the past couple of years that people are slowly starting to understand. But I think that's still a thought that's quite radical that we hold, that we probably still have to make sure we push out to the wider world, and that we also hold it true when we're building and creating these things.
So one of our contrarian beliefs is that the prevailing computing architecture is actually hybrid. We love the benefits of decentralization, especially the permissionless nature of decentralized infrastructure and DeFi, of course. At the same time, for this movement to really grow 10x, 100x beyond where we are today, inevitably, we're going to be integrating and interoperating with existing entities. And that requires an infrastructure that bridges the two worlds, the decentralized world and the centralized world. And sometimes I run into decentralization maxis who push back against that, no, as any element of centralization you introduce, it's going to be bad. But the reality is the existing centralized systems are not going to fade away, and they do hold on to a lot of users and assets and capital. So for us to grow as a movement, we have to make these integration points happen, and in an ever easier way, so that developers don't need to twist their minds just to make some simple API calls off-chain. So that's a belief that is somewhat contrarian in the decentralized world, but we strongly believe that is going to be what's required to take us to the next 2 orders of magnitude of growth.
And I think as long as we hold that true while we build, we will be fine. Because I know over the last few days, everyone's been talking about TradFi coming in, institutions coming in. And I think the worst decision we can make is just letting them come in and try suck us in back into the old world. Like, we need to keep pushing onto them that this is the way forward, and integrate them, because there is value integrating them. But yeah, completely agree.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, guys. That brings us up on time. So thank you all for being up here today. Thanks, everyone. Been a great audience. And thanks again to the Blockworks group. It's been an awesome conference.